my name's Hannah Sloggett and I'm co-founder of Nudge Community Builders on Union Street. So Nudge Community Builders is a community benefit society, and it was set up by local residents to bring empty buildings back into use in our community in a way that invests back locally and makes lasting change in kind of fun and interesting ways.
In my opinion, you're really turning community regeneration on its head, and you're supporting and facilitating communities to regenerate themselves. How does that model work, and why is it so important?
In my experience as a volunteer locally, what I realised was that quite a lot of regeneration happens in a way that's led either by organisations that have quite a lot of power and influence, or it's directed by where the funding comes from, when actually as a community we're a relatively constant body. People come and go, but actually the issues and the challenges roll on, whether organisations dip in or out. And so we got increasingly interested in how to make more lasting change. So that's why we're particularly interested in the ownership of buildings, for example. So it's less about kind of short-term projects, that's important, but actually if you're going to make long-term difference, then the ownership and how you spend your money and how you operate as an organisation are actually really, really important, because quite often what happens with regeneration normally is that actually, although it's really well intentioned, a lot of the benefits leave the area, whether that's by investors that are making money that they then move on to the next city, or whether it's staff that come in that are really knowledgeable and get to know a local community and then leave. So we really wanted to find a different way of doing it that is more lasting.
What role does local resilience play in the work that you do, and I guess the community's ability to be able to operate in that way?
So I think we're more resilient partly because of the ownership. So it's that idea of actually if you own something, it's forever really if you look after it. So when we own properties and things like that, all the investment that we're making, whether that is something special out on the street or whether it's, you know, sort of intrinsic to the building, you're constantly reinvesting into what is essentially ours. So I think that certainly in this climate has made us more resilient. I think there's also something about how we operate, so that we're really interested in the ecosystem in our community. So we talk about sort of building on from things. So what's already great and how can we build on from that rather than doing our own thing? How can we contribute? How can we lift others as we climb? So as we've grown, we've been really conscious of all the great organisations locally. It's like, how can we spend money with them? How can we really make sure that they're also moving forward alongside us, and that sort of bigger ecosystem in our community gets strengthened by what we're doing.
And so I think the work that you're doing is obviously very important, that it's about a location within a city and that you have this kind of very intense long-term view of supporting that community. But I'm interested to understand how you would scale your work as a kind of best practice to a city level. So how does a city like Plymouth kind of adopt the methodologies and apply it across a city?
I think there's definitely stuff around making local choices, whether it's local spend or value in local skills. Quite often we can feel that someone from outside of the city is more experienced, or, you know, is going to do a better job. And actually I find that the accountability with local businesses means that, you know, you get really great results and you're investing in all those local skills. So I think there's a lot more we could do around making local choices. It's kind of focused on individuals wanting to choose to shop locally, or big organisations and how they procure. There's a massive gap in the middle, which I think could make a real difference. I think there's something about how we take others' with us. Quite often we can be quite focused on our own organisation or our own sector, and so I think some of those values around actually, you know, if you find yourself in a strong position, it's like rather than looking and seeing people sort of fall into the wayside, it's like actually how can we all build together? And generally it's you know, Plymouth isn't that transient of a place aside from the sort of student population, and so those investments are wise, I think, if we support all organisations to kind of be in a much stronger a stronger place. I think that as a city it would be great if we cared more about ownership, just generally. So I think, you know, too many sites or buildings get acquired by people that don't have that local accountability, and I think by by kind of finding a way through that and finding a way to manage that risk. So often those decisions are driven by managing risk and wanting to go with bigger organisations or bigger developers because they're less risky. But actually, if we were able to find a way of managing that risk and caring for each other, whether we acted as guarantors for each other and things like that, I think there's opportunities to really get like large amounts of the city into better ownership rather than looking outside all the time for those solutions.
I think it's sort of a point you made earlier, how we think about facilitation rather than ownership moving forward, I think is really, really key. And that applies to kind of us understanding where we think the expertise lie as well, because actually I think this whole situation has shown that expertise, ideas, innovation, creativity, you know, doesn't just sit with the large organisations or even the specialist organisations. It sits in communities and within individuals who all of a sudden have just said, actually, I'll do that. I've never considered myself an artist before, but I'll do that. Never considered myself a gardener, but I'll do that. And there's this kind of empowering space that we're in at the moment, and it's interesting to see what conditions we'd need to create to facilitate that in the future, so that it isn't necessarily just out of crisis necessity, but it's a way of empowering people to continue to operate in that way, I think.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, I've really liked some of the work that we've done with individual people who, like, you know, we're kind of seeing progress, and then, you know, you kind of start to understand the small things that you can wrap around that person to enable them to then, you know, go from being a volunteer to getting some paid work to getting a commission to like making something practically happen out in the street. And so I think there's a responsibility for organisations to create that environment rather than to try and control that environment. And that's been my experience of like commissioning and things like that. I think all of that is really interesting because you instantly get kind of a power dynamic that is actually really quite judgmental, and so, you know, we've had more success from kind of setting out the sort of intrinsic things that we want around colour and joy and the spaces and things like that, and then finding ways to kind of let go rather than make the choices. And so I think there's stuff for kind of creative organisations around that, around also, you know, not holding that sort of that power, but actually trusting their instincts and trusting that by, you know, making kind of informed choices, because most people in Plymouth knows everyone else, and you know, so you kind of, by making those informed choices and investment, I think you can kind of free up a bit of the control as well.
Yeah, and I think we'll quite quickly after this start to see those organisations that have just hold on in order to resume status quo, and those organisations that have gone, okay, this is absolutely the heart of what we do. We have a community that we're supporting, and our role is to adapt and adjust in order to continue to support that organisation or those communities. And so people really reviewing their role and their purpose as an organisation. I think we might not see it now, lots of people are doing lots of good things, but I think we'll see it when we start to move into the next phase of whatever COVID looks like, or whatever post-COVID looks like, and really start to see people returning to those values, or returning to what they had hoped they'd be able to do anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
quite interesting.
Yeah, it'd be interesting, I think. I mean, I think there's also, you know, I'm really keen to kind of try and find ways to retain some of the sort of learning from this. You know, people are talking about like a kindness economy and things like that, and it's kind of like finding ways where we can be I guess it comes back to that point about growth as well. It's like you don't have to all the time be bigger. You can be like okay and doing this bit brilliantly, and then you can support others to kind of do the other elements of it, rather than kind of growing and sort of swallowing up smaller organizations, or kind of, you know, things that other people could potentially do better. So I don't know, I think it'll be interesting to see how, rather than kind of collaboration to get funding or collaboration to do a project, it's actually just like ongoing all the time. You know, we're working with these different people because they share our values, and they also want to kind of make a more lasting difference. And I think that will be really interesting to see whether that actually plays out, or whether we go back to just being driven to want to do projects to attract finance, or to, you know, to kind of keep going.
Yeah, and I think there's something about being able to try and attach some kind of value to what's happened. So this idea of kindness isn't just because of the time that we're in. It has a value as a way of operating, but I'm not sure we've ever been able to attribute that value or articulate that value before. So rather than it being put into a pocket that was, well, it was really necessary for that time to make people feel good. Now, how do we take that lesson, exactly like you're saying, and move it into a space that actually says this is a choice in a way of operating, and it has value and it has impact in doing that. I'm not sure we've quite figured out how to do that yet, but it's an important thing to be able to facilitate organisations to continue to work in that way.
Although I think we will be able to calculate value from some of the more sort of social care side of things and things like that. Do you know what I mean? It's like the cost of someone going on to universal credit, or the cost of you know, someone needing care in their home vs your neighbour shopping for you, and things like that. I think there's things like that I think we, as a result of this happening, will actually have really clear examples of how that can save the wider system costs, which I think will be really interesting. And even when we were looking at the laptops, I mean, it's cheaper to buy a new laptop, but it isn't when you look at the whole associated costs of a new laptop, environmentally, socially and economically, fees, paying a local person to repurpose an existing laptop, and all the associated costs and benefits with that. So I think getting more confident at how we do that, and making sure that decision makers value those wider costs, I think is really important.